Hey groupers, Pastor Marshall. I hope that you're having some great snacks in group. I'm a little jealous of that. I'm a little jealous that I don't get those homemade goodies that you're getting, but I hope that you're enjoying those and enjoying each other's company, and I'm glad that you've come to group tonight. I'd like you to do two things to get started before you read the text. First of all, I'd like you to share some humiliation stories. What's the most humiliating thing that's ever happened to you? And let's keep these G-rated. Maybe it's not going to be the most humiliating thing that's ever happened, but it's something that you can tell in a church group that is humiliating. And then second thing, after you've shared your humiliation stories, is I'd like you to talk about the difference between humility and humiliation. They are derivatives of each other, but I do think that there's some differences. So who is someone that you know that is humble? And if you ask that person, would they tell you, yeah, I can see that? I think that'd be an interesting discussion. I'll tell you one story. When I was in college, I preached the first church I ever preached at in La Hart, Kansas, a little bitty tiny town on the side of the highway. And yeah, it's one of those towns, if you blink, you'd miss it. The first Sunday that Claudia and I were there to try out to become their preaching pastor, there were 10 people. Claudia and I were 2 of those 10. They hired me. I began to preach. The church began to grow. And God did great things at that church. And it wasn't too long before we were running close to 100 and then over 100. And well, the church had been left in disrepair for decades and decades, and things had accumulated for decades and decades. That just tends to be the way that it is at churches. And so we were going to have this huge work day because we needed these rooms that were full of stuff to be used for classrooms, Sunday school rooms. And so we brought in a big dumpster, and we had this humongous work day, and breakfast and lunch was provided, and people worked so hard all day long. And we were checking things off our list. Well, it was the end of the day. It was getting dark, and folks were going home for supper, and I was ready to go home for supper as well, and I had to preach the next day, of course, so I have good excuses. There was one thing left on the list. There was this pantry in the kitchen that had been built specifically for communion, although we had not used it for communion for a long, long time because it was disgusting. The truth is that mice had made their home in this pantry, and it was feral. It had such a smell. It was awful. And so we had it on the list. Well, when it got done that night and I was locking up the church and the last one to leave, I knew that it needed to be cleaned and I didn't want to touch it. I decided in my mind, I'll do it next weekend. When I got to church the next morning, I opened up and I went to get communion out. And of course, we didn't keep communion in that cabinet, but it was pretty close. And so when you got close to that cabinet, you could smell that smell. And I didn't smell it. I opened up the cabinet and it had been cleaned. It was spotless. The inside had been painted. New paper had been put down. It was gorgeous. And I would find out that a man named Joe Riebel, who I had just recently baptized, and he was a member of the National Guard, and that weekend was guard weekend for him, and he had gotten home late that Saturday night, and he felt bad that he hadn't been able to go to the workday. So he went up to the church and he got in with a key that he had from an elder. And he went and found the list, and he found the one thing, and he spent hours cleaning, scrubbing, removing that smell, repairing the hole in the bottom of the cabinet where the mice were coming and going, and making it new. That's humble service. Well, a few things that I want you to talk about. First, Jesus begins this section by teaching about sin, specifically how we cause people to sin. Wow, now that's a tough subject. I didn't talk about this on Sunday. I didn't go into it. But Jesus literally uses a word that we would be something in the road that people would trip over and they would fall down. Now, that has some teeth in it. If you think about someone who is going to heaven and we trip them up and they fall and never get up again, or they're on their way to a right relationship with God. They're pursuing God. And maybe they're pursuing God because of us, because we're Christians. We're in their life and we've been trying to point them in the right direction. But there's things in our lives that cause them to sin. And they fall down and they never get back up, get back on that path again. That's a heavy subject. Paul talks about this, teaches about this in Romans chapter 14 and in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, 9, and 10. Small group leaders, and that you will read through those chapters and pick out some verses. I think that you could take your small group through a few verses in those passages and glean some from Paul's expanded teaching on this subject. But then ultimately, this is the question. How responsible are we for other people's sins? Because Jesus says that if we cause them to sin, we're going to be held responsible. How responsible are we for other people's sins? First thing I want you to talk about. Second thing I want you to talk about is what A fun subject it is to think about rebuking someone. Now, that's the kind of thing the church can really get around. Well, that's the second thing Jesus talks about. Who do we have the right to rebuke? First question. Second, who do we have the responsibility to rebuke? I think that the answers to those questions are different. Third, how do we rebuke? Jesus teaches more about this, and it's recorded in Matthew chapter 18, verses 15 through 20. He teaches us 3 steps. I think that you should write those 3 steps down. Everybody in group should write those 3 steps down. Paul also adds to this discussion in Ephesians chapter 4, verses 14 and 15. And I think you should look up that passage as well and add to this conversation. Third, next Jesus talks about forgiveness. He says that for believers, forgiveness is habitual, it's unending. The question cannot be, are we willing to forgive? The question cannot be, how many times will we forgive? The question cannot be, what will we forgive? Those are not given to us as options. The followers of Christ are going to forgive. So my question is, what boundaries do we put in place in our lives when we forgive? We have no option of putting a boundary over our hearts. Forgiveness is a heart issue. We can't put a boundary there. But what boundaries do we put in our lives? Or do we even have the right to put boundaries? What is Jesus teaching us in this passage? Well, what do I like? I love the parable of the mom. That's my title. This servant who works all day and then comes home from working and immediately continues to make dinner for his master. And he does all of that without expecting a trophy. Because his master is God. And God is worthy of all of our service. It's a lot like who we need to be. It's a good reminder for me. This is the kind of servant that I want to be. What do I not like? Well, I don't like the Jewish lepers who don't say thank you. Did they not have good moms that taught them to write thank you notes? Maybe they didn't. But they're responsible. The Samaritan comes back and he says thank you. And this isn't a story. This isn't a parable. This is literal history. And I like that. But what I don't like is that the Jews don't respond. I don't want to be that kind of servant. I don't want to be that kind of son. Well, what do I want you to do? 3 applications that I gave you this week. First thing that I want you to do is I've challenged you every day to start the day, at the beginning of the day, doing something for someone else, saying something nice to them, complimenting them, doing something that they would normally have to do and you would do it for them. In your home, at work, in the church, in the community, doing something for somebody else. That's what humility really is. Second, I challenge you every single day to end the day with 3 specific confessions. Confessions of things that you did that day that you wish that you had not done. And own up to it. And I think that you should write those things down every night because those written reminders will be helpful in overcoming those sins. And then third, I challenge you to spend every night saying 3 things at the end of the day that you're thankful for. And I want to challenge you to make those things big things. Now, sure, we are thankful for when we get to work on time. But I'm not always sure that's a miracle. Sometimes it is. But I'm not always sure that it's a miracle. I'm challenging you to spend a few minutes every night thinking about your day and the big things that happened that day that God was responsible for, and you would give him credit. You would say, thank you, because that's the kind of sons and daughters that we want to be. Well, I hope that you have a great group. God bless, and I'll see you Sunday as we continue our march through the Gospel of Luke.